Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our program today. I hope everyone has your tea ready as we pay homage to our suffragists who organized tea parties and even branded their own tea called Equality. This is going to be a very interesting and informative, and I might say timely discussion today. I'm Commissioner Lori Day, and I have had the pleasure of serving on the Florida Commission for the Status of Women for the last couple of years. Starting in 1991, the Commission, which is a nonpartisan body, became comprised of 22 commissioners who focused on raising awareness of women's contributions and successes across the state. The Commission hosts community conversations like these and educational forums and seminars on issues impacting the lives of women. If you'd like to know more about the Commission, we invite you to come check out our website, see some of the things coming up, and you can find that at www.fcsw.net. Part of the Missions Commission is to recognize and celebrate the history of women and how it has become woven into our fabric of our state and our national story. The courageous vision championed by women of past generations is remarkable, and it inspires us to defend our dreams and also create opportunities for those yet to come. This year, 2020, marks the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which allows U.S. citizens to vote regardless of sex. For 70 years, women throughout the United States have organized and petitioned at the state and national levels for their right to vote. And on August 18th in 1920, the U.S. women won a huge battle, and it became the ratification of the 19th Amendment in Tennessee. Since then, women have largely exercised this right, and as a matter of fact, in every U.S. presidential election dating back to 1984, women have outturned at the voting poll at slightly higher levels than men. And women, quite frankly, are running for office more now, and we're going to learn more about that. Joining us today who's going to give us some insight onto the impact of women voting is none other than Dr. Susan McManus. I'd like to tell you a little bit about her before she jumps in. And quite frankly, she probably doesn't need much of an introduction. She probably feels like kind of a household name right now, as well as a familiar face. But Dr. McManus is a distinguished university professor at USF. She's in the political science area, and Dr. McManus received her MA from the University of Michigan and her PhD from from Florida State University. Dr. McManus lives in Florida and is a native Floridian, and she has authored and co-authored a number of publications, and you can find those in a variety of venues, but I'd encourage you to check out Florida's Minority Trailblazers, the men and women who changed the face of Florida government. So from 1998 to 2015, Dr. McManus served as a political analyst for WFLA News Channel 8. And since 2016, she has been a political analyst for the ABC Action News. You may have seen her on a variety of broadcasts because she has appeared on every major broadcast in cable television and radio network and has been interviewed by major newspapers in Florida, in the US, and quite frankly, across the world. She serves on the UF Bob Graham Center for Public Service Council of Advisors and on the board of directors of the Florida Tax Watch Center for Florida Citizenship. She claimed Tax Watch Center for Florida Citizenship and chaired the Florida Elections Commission from 1999 to 2003. And by the way, just so you know, going into our conversation, Dr. McManus is not affiliated with any political party. Welcome, Dr. McManus. I'd like to turn our program over to you, and thank you so much for being here today.
Well, it's absolutely a pleasure to be here. I'm very honored to be asked to do this. This is a great year in so many ways, and what an election that we're having right now. And obviously, I'm trying to get my program up here, which, let's see if I can get it. My presentation, I don't know, can you see it or not?
Yes, we can, Dr.
There we
McManus.
go. Okay, terrific. Thank you. It's a little slow here on the whatever. And now, but what a year. And I want to focus a lot today on how we've gotten to the record year in terms of women running for office and the role of women in politics. We are, quite frankly, the nation's most diverse swing state and have been for decades. But especially this year, we're getting a lot of attention because how close we are and how diverse we are, and how important in terms of our share of the electoral college votes that are needed to elect a president. No state looks like this. These are the trend lines in terms of party registration, and it doesn't get any more competitive between Democrats and Republicans than it is right now in Florida, with only about 134, 135,000 registrants differ between Democrats and Republicans. But as we're going to see here today, one of the real stories of Florida politics and the involvement of women has been the rise of the no party affiliation, which is a growing portion of our electorate and very important and often very split. Just a little bit about our state. We have 10 media markets. Some states only have one. 45% of our registered voters right now live in the I-4 corridor, which is the Tampa and Orlando media markets, and followed by the two Southeast Florida markets, Miami and Palm Beach, and then Jacksonville and so forth. Now, while we have a few markets that are very small in a state like ours, you cannot ignore any of these markets. And there are women voters, obviously, in all 10. It is true that the most competitive from a party perspective are the I-4 corridor markets, where the difference between Democrats and Republicans is narrowest. So that would be Tampa and Orlando, again, down the way. But you can see some markets like Panama City where there's obviously one party more dominant. And if you look in some of the other ones, you see, for example, Miami more Democratic dominant than the state at large. But this is another dimension of Florida that's critical in understanding the difficulties of campaigning here, and on the plus side, the diversity of women in our state and their interest in involvement in politics. But you can see drastic differences in the racial and ethnic composition of Florida's 10 media markets, with the most diverse and a majority non-white, the Miami media market. But a lot of other places that are more one party oriented or one race oriented, but for the most part, you put it all together in winning a statewide race, that you have to reach all these different places and all the women in them, often a little bit differently. It is true that women make up 52% of Florida's registrants. It's also important that you note that around 3% of our registrants refuse to accept a binary definition of gender. And I'm going to show you some patterns on that. But it is true that for a long while, women have been a majority of Florida's registrants. We also have some interesting patterns here when you compare Florida's female voters and male voters. You'll notice among our women voters that registrants that a plurality are Democrats, followed by Republicans, and then NPAs. Among males, it's plurality Republicans and Democrats and NPAs. But among this other group, who's frankly among their younger population, you see more NPAs. So you really have to consider all of these kinds of differences when you think about the women's vote in Florida. It's also true that women make up a larger share of Florida's Democrats than Republicans. There's still a plurality of Republicans and also of NPAs, but not other, which would be libertarians and minor parties. Our diversity statewide looks like this. These are current registered voters. Hispanics, 17% of the share, Blacks, 13%, Asians, 2%, other, which is often biracial or multiracial. It's also true that we see the biggest gender gap among our racial and ethnic minorities. I've highlighted them here on this graphic. where you see that it is particularly noticeable that there are a larger share of women, Hispanic voters, registered voters, Blacks, and Asians. And it's a little bit narrow among Florida's white population. But there's a big reason why you see this real gender gap among women of color. And it's because of the fact, and these are national statistics, but they're also true in Florida. If you look at who's going to college and who's getting degrees, associates, these are associates and bachelors, you'll see that there is a tremendous gender gap within these minority communities, and it's women who are the ones who are going forward with education, and that affects their participation in running for office and a lot of other things. It's also true that Florida is not just a senior state like so many people think. In fact, 45% of our current registrants are under age 50, and 45% of them is a number that a lot of people just are staggered by when they see. I personally prefer to use generations as a way of looking at how women of different generations and ages are targeted in outreach and issues and so forth. And this particular slide shows you why, as political analysts, we tend to prefer this way of looking at age. So if you look at the baby boomers, the 56 to 74-year-olds, all the different presidents that span the maturation of that generation and the different kinds of issues, and then you fast forward to Generation Z, which is the 18 to 23-year-olds, and the experiences that they've had. I call them the hashtag generation, by the way. Only two presidents. Look at Congress as doing absolutely nothing to help them particularly. The way that they communicate with each other, the issues, social justice, the environment, and so forth are predominant. Very, very different than the older generations. And so you simply cannot reach all women in Florida through the same messages or the same issues or the same means of communications. It is true that these two youngest generations were getting a lot of attention this election year because they're the growing generations, and that's Generation Z, and the millennials are, slightly over a third. But if you add Generation X, the three youngest generations together are well over half of Florida's registered voters, and yet so much attention this election is focused on older women, which in my judgment may be a mistake for candidates and parties who are just doing that. It's also true that you have a very different and wider gender gap among older generation, greatest generation, compared to Generation Z, and you'll notice there that there's much less difference in terms of gender gap, but you also see a higher percentage of people who are, registering as will refuse to give their gender ID, and that's a growing pattern among younger voters. This tells it all. This is a pattern that we're seeing not only in Florida, but across the country, and that's because Florida is often a bellwether state looking ahead. By far more younger generation members are choosing to register as no party affiliation, and I gave you some reasons why. This disgruntlement with politics as usual among the two parties. But let's switch over now a little bit. We've gone through registration, the different forms of activism that have characterized women's involvement in the political process nationally as well as in Florida. And I want to focus particularly on the last two because these are really the focal points of this year's election. Women running for office and hopefully winning offices. And to put it in perspective, we've come a long way since the early days. This gives us a feel for the fact that women are increasingly successful in grabbing offices in Florida, statewide executive offices, legislative and congressional offices. Still not where we'd like to be, but certainly that number is growing. But it's certainly important that we take a look at where we've come from. And a lot of this, I'm going to kind of go through it quickly because this will be posted online, and I would really like to focus on the 2020 election a little bit more, but it's important that we look at where we've come from. The first woman legislator was elected from Orange County, Edna Giles Fuller, in 1929. Then the first African-American woman elected from Miami, Gwen Cherry, 1970. And these quotes are from the book that I've written. I interviewed and studied the backgrounds and bios of a lot of these important women. And I love this quote because it pretty much reflects what a shock it was to the system at the time she was elected. The first Hispanic woman, a Cuban from South Florida, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. She has a lot of firsts to her all the way through. First in the Florida House, first Cuban in the Florida Senate, first Hispanic woman ever in the U.S. House of Representatives. And you'll see Florida does have a lot of national trailblazers. The first woman of Asian ancestry, a Korean, is again from South Florida, Mimi McAndrews. Again, she was sort of a trailblazer and said she didn't realize how many Asian voters there were till she got elected and started getting a lot of contact. The first woman state senator, Beth Johnson. I think this is a lovely award that she received, the Susan B. Anthony Award, Democratic Woman of the Year, and the fact that she represented the 19th Amendment. What an accolade. Much attention to Carrie Meek, the first Black woman elected to the Florida Senate and the first two elected to the U.S. Congress from Florida. What a quote this was. And this was 1982 when she got elected to the Senate. And everyone was making a lot about it. And she says, well, should we have to make such a to-do about this? It should have happened a long time ago. But what a fighter. If we turn to our executive branch, you'll see that we have had 3 women lieutenant governors in Florida's history and represent the 3 largest racial and ethnic groups in our state. How about that? Toni Jennings, Jennifer Carroll, and our current Jeanette Nunez. The first woman elected to the Florida cabinet was, as Commissioner of Education, was Betty Castor from the Tampa area. And she had also served in the Senate as a pro tem and as president of the University of South Florida. I had to say that. First and only 2 women that have been attorneys general, part of the cabinet. Relatively recent event there. A lot of it's because more women are going to law school and more women are going to the judicial positions, as we'll see. And the first woman commissioner of agriculture, Nikki Fried. All of these really relatively recent. But it is true that we are currently being served by the first majority female cabinet in Florida's history. To turn to the judiciary, you really begin to see the entry of women at the trial court level and expanding their presence among district courts of appeal judges and Supreme Court justices. A lot of that, as I mentioned, again, has to do with education, and you certainly see it. The first woman Supreme Court justice appointed in 1985 was what we call, really kind of had a multiracial background. She was an Arab American justice, but she also was often referred to as the first Hispanic justice from where she came from. And she was the first female Chief Justice, but it was 1992. Peggy Quince, the first Black woman on the Supreme Court from Tampa, and the first Black woman elected to a statewide office because she had to go through a retention election, which was a statewide election, and the first African American Chief Justice. The first Hispanic woman to the court is a relatively recent appointee from Miami, but she's already gone on to the Federal Court of Appeals. But again, path-breaking, all these women. And in terms of Congress, the first woman from Congress elected from Florida was Ruth Bryan Owen. I think most people know her name, as she went on to serve in a number of other capacities in the United Nations. First Hispanic woman to Congress, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, elected in 1989. And we have 2 firsts Black women elected to the U.S. House from Florida. Carrie Meek, 1992. I love this particular experience, this expression, because she was friends, very close friends, with the second woman who was also elected in 92, Corinne Brown, who points out that Gwen Sawyer Cherry from her FAMU days really got her interested in politics. And this says a lot about the role of women in mentorship in encouraging other women to run for office. In terms of our first and only U.S. Senator, female U.S. Senator from Florida was Paula Hawkins, elected in 1991. Today, you would be outraged if you saw anybody asking a U.S. Senator female about who was going to do her laundry. Let's get real. So this is where I want to really emphasize today is how many races we have up and how many women we have running for congressional and state legislative contests in Florida, and how much of a difference, depending on which party prevails or which candidate prevails, how much of a difference they could make in terms of the makeup of the Florida delegation to the U.S. Congress and particularly to the Florida Senate. Probably not going to make a lot of difference in terms of Democratic pickup of the House, but most likely there will be women who gain seats there. We'll probably see an increase in women who are elected. But take a look at this staggering number. 177 women ran for either a congressional seat or a state Senate seat or a state House seat this year. Unbelievable. And you see there was greater sort of party parity on women candidates running for Congress, about equal percentages of Republican and Democratic women running for Congress. For the Senate and the House, more Democrats than Republicans. But this is also a staggering revelation and outcome of so many women going to college and getting into politics and the pathway being laid for them by those before them, and the emphasis on diversity and the diversity in our population at large. Look at this, 46% of all of the women candidates running this year were women of color. And the tremendous background, Blacks, Latinas, those from Middle Eastern or North African countries, Asians, multiracial. Only one were we unable to discern the gender for, but this is a remarkable change in the candidacies that we're seeing for offices in our state. 131 of them made it to the general election, but you also see the number of women who are ending up, a number of these races that are ending up as women versus women. Again, a remarkable change in the faces of who's running for office. And the fact of the matter is when you have women from both parties running against each other, it reflects the maturation of our system and the sort of, it's no longer news when you have a woman running for a seat in the Florida legislature or the Congress. So you hear there's a racial makeup of the 131 women who are running in the general election this time. Again, varied tremendously, diversity, loud and clear. And so much of this, as I mentioned, many of these new candidates are first-time candidates or, you know, maybe second-time candidates, but a lot of this is, I go back to our educational system in our state. It's producing more women than men, but it's also producing women who believe in activism and the equity of representation, whether it's in the business world, the political world, the nonprofit world. But you clearly see that. And this also explains why we're seeing an increase this year. NPR has sort of headlined that 2020 is the year of the woman donor, and the campaign contributions are surging. And a lot of that, again, tracks back to women becoming more successful in every profession, seeing an importance of giving money to candidates, being players in the political process in terms of campaign contributions. We in Florida have two groups that focus a lot of their donations. They're donor groups that have a partisan and ideological leaning to them. For the Democrats, it's Ruth's List, and for Republicans, it's Maggie's List. And the contributions for these two groups have been going up up and up every single year. So now we've looked at sort of registration and activism and candidacies. Let's look at who votes. What are the voting patterns? Do women vote alike here, or what do we see traditionally in our state? First, we have to take a look at what Florida looks like. These are county-based maps. The two maps on the left show you the pattern. The red is a county that went Republican, and blue would be a county that went Democrat. The lighter shades reflect smaller margins. And if you just go from 2012 to 2016, there's some changes. But then if you go over to the governor's race in 2018, you see, again, some of the areas are becoming a little bit bluer or a little bit lighter shade of red and blue. And that sort of explains why we had such a tight election in 2018. But I love this headline when it ran in the New York Times, and I knew from the first time I see it that this would be a must in any program that I've given this election cycle that focuses on women, because there is a tendency to say the women's vote. But as we've clearly seen already, it's the women's votes. People, and women particularly, don't think alike. And anybody that tries to cast it as this monolithic vote are making a very big mistake in Florida. And I love these two photos. They were both from a Palm Beach Post article that sort of contrasted and emphasized this particular headline. You even see this in the voting patterns a little bit about how Florida women voted in the presidential race 4 years ago. And you see that women were 53% of the voters. This was from an exit poll. But the women's vote in Florida, 50% voted for Clinton and 46% for Trump, was the closest of any state in the entire country. And then you turn to the governor's race, and you see in that off-year election or midterm year election that a few more women voted than men than did in the 2016 race. But you also see that it turned a little bit bluer. So what are we thinking about right now as to what we might expect in 2016? Well, let's just take a look here, because you see that if you look at gender and party, you kind of see that Democrat men and women voted for Clinton, Republican men and women voted for Trump. But if you actually take independent men and independent women, they were much more divided. And that's the difficulty of reaching these NPA voters who are independent or no party for a lot of reasons. And then you see the independent women voted a little bit more blue in 2018 in the governor's race. And a lot of that too is also driven by age. As we said earlier, a larger and larger share of NPAs tend to be younger voters. It is also true, we've looked at vote patterns. Now let's take a look at the really, really important one in our state, and that's turnout. Now, this is a national statistic that I think was cited by Lori in her introduction, and that is that women have outvoted men in terms of turning out to vote since 1980 across the country. And if you just take a look at, in 2018, Florida, the vote party and gender, you'll see that women, particularly among Democrats, turned out at a much higher rate than men or people who were other gender. But in general, the Republican turnout is higher than Democrat in Florida, and that's been that way for a while as well. So here we are. Once again, Florida toss up, as we have been for the last 4 or 5 elections. This has never strayed. This is a very famous map put out by Larry Sabato at the University of Virginia. And from the get-go, they have been putting Florida as a toss-up. Now, the numbers at the top have changed a little bit, but the toss-up version has never changed. And wouldn't you know, if you haven't seen enough TV ads, well, here's the reason why. Because the fact that Florida is the most divided state in the country and the biggest prize in terms of electoral college votes. Already $1 billion has been spent on TV ads just in 6 key states. And not surprisingly, the most is spent in, you guessed it, Florida. And if you really analyze who is featured in these TV ads, a predominance, I would estimate at least 80 to 90% of the people and issues, particularly photos of people featured in those TV ads, are women. And you can see again how much money, more money has been expended on TV by the Biden campaign and allied groups than Trump in Florida. But it's really, really difficult to predict who's going to win in this crazy state that we're in, an exciting state, I might add, as a political scientist. Our population grows between one election and another. We really don't know what issue is going to be the issue that really pushes somebody in one direction or another. We only have a couple weeks now before the election, but depending if something could happen between now and then that might cause a voter who's on the edge about A, voting, and B, who to vote for, to move in one direction. And we've already seen 2 major events occur within the last month of this campaign: the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the Supreme Court vacancy, and then a presidential candidate and the president himself sidelined and hospitalized with the very disease that's the focal point of this election. Plus, we see this tremendous generational divide. I didn't talk much about the ideology, but younger voters are very much more progressive than older voters on issues and on communication ways. They're much more Snapchat, older people Facebook, if you're on, just to take a generational social media divide. And of course, in our state, we're a hard state to poll in because we have such diversity. And obviously, if you're wondering, I'm nearing the end here, if you're wondering why women who are wondering if their vote's going to count or matters in our state, all you have to do is look at this staggering history of elections in Florida. And you see 5 elections in a row, statewide elections, 3 governors and 2 presidential. The margin of victory has been 1% or less. And in fact, it was 0.5% in the 2018 governor's race and went to a recount. There's no other state that is this kind of divided but yet representative view of sort of the country at large than Florida. So absolutely, we are looking at this as the reason why we've done this program today. For anybody who even for a second thinks that the women's vote isn't going to matter and matter hugely in 2020, all you have to do is to look at where we are in Florida. So I'll end with this slide. What an enormously interesting and exciting and sometimes frustrating and everything else. What a great year to have the celebration of the women, the inception of the women's vote, where we were struggling to get any voice heard, to the point now of where we are, that where women's voices are going to be heard loud and clear and could make the difference in who wins the presidency of the United States. So thank you.
Wow, that was fascinating and gosh, so timely. I thought I'd stayed up to date with so much, but you really brought such interesting facts and things to consider to mind. So we're going to open it up for some questions in a few minutes. So if our audience wants to start thinking about questions and maybe put those in your chat, we're going to do that. But before we open it up to the audience, I thought it would be really fun if we did a poll and did a couple of kind of questions to see our audience population and just to get to know who all's here with us together. So Kelly, I think you and the commission team are ready to put a poll up. There we go. Are you voting for the very first time in this election? And we will show the results as they come in. So if everyone could take a minute and just answer that first poll, be awesome. All right. So our next poll coming up here is, do I see a next poll? Poll, please. It's coming up. Here we go. So curious. We heard Dr. McManus talk about the contribution level going into women candidates. Contribution can be volunteerism or both. Would love to know for our audience today, how many have volunteered, contributed, done both, or perhaps haven't done that yet? If you could let us know, that'd be great. Fantastic. And I think we have, oh, look at that. So I didn't see the results of the first one, but here, if we look, we have almost half, almost 50% of our audience with us today has both contributed and volunteered. So I think that's a pretty phenomenal showing of how we're all getting involved as women in what's happening in our state and in our country. And I think we may have one more poll, if I'm not mistaken. Here we go. So Dr. McManus talked about the different generations and would love for everyone to select the generation that you associate with. We've consolidated the greatest generation and the silent generation all together as one. But if you would just note here where you fall. All right, I can't wait to see the results here. So over half are baby boomers, followed by Generation X, and our silent and greatest generation at 20, and then we have 5% that are in our millennial population. Fascinating. So with that question, I think the first question I'd like to bring up to Dr. McManus, and maybe you could give us some insight. You talked about how the parties are really focused on capturing the women's vote. What are the parties doing individually to reach out to women of all voting capacities? Could you talk a little bit about what the messages are or how they're approaching the marketing around getting women to vote for them?
Well, I think it's really even hard to say that there's any one thing. For example, let's just take Latinas in South Florida. Latina voters, the way that the parties often reach out to those voters is through organizing things in the community. Caravans, you've seen a lot of them. Both parties are getting in cars. It's a tradition that comes from a lot of Latin countries that a lot of them have ties to, things like that. In contrast, if you take Black women voters, it's often through the issue of social justice or racial injustices at the moment getting a lot of attention. There, it's often through churches and through women's organizations like Black women's sororities is a very common way that messages are transferred. For rural, white women, for example, you have to use a message of sometimes particularly the economy, or if you're in a farm area, maybe you stress how much is being done on trade bills by one candidate or another. Or you church more religious, you stress more religious diversity and reaching some of the rural women. For suburban women, it's often the messages are aimed right at the suburban mom with kids. So for some mothers right now, the messaging might be, if you're the Republicans, trying to encourage and support back to school as opposed to online instruction. Or for moms with kids, it's all about the education. I'd say for Democrats are sort of stressing stay-at-home options, but for Black mothers, sometimes school choice is an issue. For other suburban women, it's the economy. For others, it's safety and security, worried about law and order and violence coming into their neighborhoods. That's why it's so hard to give a succinct answer. But you see people, for younger women, using music celebrities, social celebrities, people that have exciting websites that are well known in blogs. You go through that. You go through their social media networks. You don't count on television ads to particularly move those younger women with messaging because they're not looking at it. And by the way, I noticed no Gen Zers here today. Hopefully they're all at school, but not all of them, but a lot of them will be at school. So I think it's just the issues can vary, but more importantly, you have to understand, as we sort of did in this presentation, I have to look at the intersection. And now that's a big movement. I have a young woman who helped me do the candidacy research here, who's a researcher now at the Center for American Women Politics at Rutgers. She's working on her PhD. And she says that most of their discussion these days is about a term called intersectionality, which we sort of did. So for some women, it's you have to understand what intersects with their gender that's going to push them. Is it an issue? Is it their race? Is it their religion? Is it their party? And which of those weighs most on their minds when they go vote? There's just, I think intersectionality is sort of the theme of what we're looking at in how to figure out how to campaign to different narrow slices of Florida's women voters, which I often describe our state as a giant jigsaw puzzle with many, many faceted pieces. And yet somebody's got to try to craft it and put the pieces together in a clear picture that lets that candidate get victory. And it's very hard. It's harder here than any other state.
Fascinating. Thank you. So we have a couple of questions coming in, and I just want to encourage again our audience to submit your questions, and we'll go through as many as we can before we come to the top of the hour. I'd like to put our first question out there that as a College Park resident, how can I physically help women voters get to the polls? So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are several ways. I think obviously transportation is often difficult for some, but if you can social distance, sometimes just walking with that person to the polling location, if it's within walking distance, or even if you transport someone and they're worried about going there, unsure with, the social distancing and all of that kind of thing. Sometimes just the physical presence. Obviously, you can't go into the polling location, but you can walk up to the location. There's also the phone. And let me tell you, this is a great question, because one thing that doesn't work is a robocall. One thing that does work is a call from a friend or a neighbor or someone you respect. And what also can often make a difference if you're an older woman is to get a call from a young woman and saying, I'm excited about voting, and can you tell me about it, and how are you going? It's the personal contact at a moment that we're in right now where some people are just afraid to go out or unsure. And also there's always the vote by mail, which the great thing about that now, it's not too late. October 24th is the last day to ask for a vote by mail ballot. But if you're afraid of the mail not getting there in time, we have drop boxes, and drop boxes are a great thing now. A person can simply go to a polling, any of these early voting sites, and put their vote by mail ballot into a drop box, which is kind of like a mailbox. But absolutely, it's going to the supervisor's office. It's going to get there. But I come back to the thing that always works best in convincing somebody is personal contact with somebody you respect and know or want to know more about.
And I think that's a great point in a lot of fronts. I couldn't agree with you more about the robocalls. I'll be so delighted when they stop ringing my phone and my text messages and all of that. But really, when you think about giving someone a call and saying, "Hey, would you like a ride? Can I help you? I'm going. You want to go with me? We can grab coffee. Bring your mask. I got my hand sanitizer." All of that. I think that's powerful. So thank you. So our second question is about, is there a measurable lag in voting for women candidates? And does discrimination against women hinder their electability, especially for the president?
Well, obviously, there is always an edge of people who think that men are better at politics than women, but you can see just from our statistics how that's changing rapidly. And, frankly, some of the first successes at the local level have been in rural areas where you might think that, well, there's probably more of a good old boy kind of thing going on. But in fact, women in a lot of those households carry their weight. And so we've seen, if you picked up a political science book on women in politics, it would talk about how sometimes places where you least suspect that there'll be open-mindedness are places where women have had to carry equal weight in terms of the economics of the home. But there's still people who will never vote for women, and there's still women that will never vote for a man at this point. But things are changing. And as there are more women candidacies, and it's old news, it's not your gender that's grabbing the attention. It's more about you personally and what you stand for and what issues you want to push for that are gradually gaining significance. We're not there yet, but I think a lot of the question came from the fact that if you were a Democrat, you had to be really disappointed in the fact that there was some really good women candidates for the presidency and they didn't make it.
Agreed. Our third question is, why do you think Republican women turnout is higher than Democratic women?
It's a good question, and I think a lot of it boils down a bit, you can't say uniformly, but somewhat to a larger percentage of them are religious, I want to say that, families where there's a little bit more money, but even that's changing. And overall, a slightly higher percentage to go to college. So you get sort of an educational gap. You get religious issues coming in. The conservatism is sort of the glue that really pushes Republican women to turn out, and more conservative values and traditions. And there's less diversity, and sometimes the racial and ethnic diversities are the ones that have had to catch up in terms of education and knowing how to campaign and support and raising money. But now, as you see more and more women of color owning businesses and again going to college and going to law school and putting money into minority candidates, that's changing a bit. But historically, in general, whether it's a Republican man or woman, the turnout has been higher. A lot of it's the reasons I mentioned.
Fantastic. So we have a final question, and then if I have time, I'm going to ask one more too, given today is the day. But the question from our audience is, what is your perspective, not on the results of the election per se, but on the results being challenged this year? What do you think will happen there? Do you think the results will be challenged?
Yes, I do, because we're so close and divided. And some of these states, it's just such a narrow window that there will be people that will get into filing lawsuits. We already know for a fact that you've probably seen stories in Florida this week about how many lawyers have been hired by the Biden campaign and also lined up by the Trump campaign. I think just a month ago, there were already, by one account, 6,000 attorneys across the country that were lined up for Biden, and I'm sure they were about the same for the president. I think it's just the stakes are so high and it's so close and so divided that people will go to whatever degree that they see is unjust, and they'll use the courts. as the venue to try and solve the problem. But it is true, on a positive note, that we have better educated Floridians, and across the country, 2/3 of Americans now are aware that we're probably not going to know all the election returns on election night, but for some very good reasons, like in our state, provisional ballots and being able to fix your absentee if you forgot to sign it, cures, and then the fact that military votes are allowed to come in 10 days after. So there's legitimate reasons why you may not know on an election night, but most people are very skeptical. We see a higher percentage than ever of people who wonder about the accuracy of it. And this is, I think, the saddest part about where we're at in this election is people not having as much confidence in the results as we would like.
Well, yes, let's hope that there's some positive healing that also comes through this. And your message certainly is a positive note for women, for our history, but as well as our future. And I think that whether you're a Republican, if you're a Democrat, if you're an NPA, that we all have a lot to be proud of where we've come. The fact that it's been 100 years and we keep getting stronger is fantastic. And the fact that we are leveraging our right to vote in a significant way is extremely important. So I'm going to encourage all of our attendees to not only, one, get out there and vote, but as Dr. McManus said, make that personal contact and reach out to someone who may either be unsure on how to go about doing that or getting there, and help them. So again, thank you, Dr. McManus, for being here. We'd like to just express our appreciation from the Commission for you taking time out of your schedule, very busy right now, to be part of what we're doing today. And I also want to just say, for those that are here, if you like what you saw today, we have more of that coming, and we'll have other teas. But again, mark your calendar. The next one is November 5th at noon for our next suffrage tea. And we're going to look at the women's impact on the judicial system. So thank you to our staff at the Commission on the Status of Women, and for all of our participants who joined us today. We appreciate you coming, and cheers to you and your tea.